Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jonathan Hunter, and I'm a representative of the Pinsker Center, the main host this evening. The Pinsker Center is a campus-based think tank which arranges discussions on global foreign policy with policymakers affecting our world. If you haven't already done so, please follow us on Facebook or Instagram, LinkedIn or Twitter to keep up to date with many future events. And I understand tonight that many students are watching, as they've been recommended to do so by their lecturers. So I, in addition to your lecturers, would very much recommend following the Pinsker Center for many other events, which I'm sure will be of benefit and relevance to your studies. And it really is my great honor to introduce our speakers this evening. But before I do so, I'd like to thank our partners, including the Conservative Associations at Reading University, at Warwick University, at UCL and King's College. I would like to thank the Politics Society at Bath University, the International Affairs Societies at Bristol and UCL, the School of Public Policy at UCL, and lastly, the Roger Scruton Center. And it really is our honor to host tonight Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, who is currently the Fouad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. General McMaster served as the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, and after graduating from the United States Military Academy in 1984, General McMaster served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years before retiring as a Lieutenant General in June 2018. From 2014 to 2017, General McMaster designed the Future Army as the director of the Army Capabilities Integration Center and the Deputy Commanding General of the US Army Training and Doctrine Command. His extensive experience leading soldiers and organizations in wartime include commands in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2012, in Iraq from 2005 to 2006, and during Operation Desert Storm from 1990 to 1991. General McMaster holds a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he is the author of his latest book, which I hold in my hand, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, which will be discussed in the webinar today. And if you haven't seen, participants are able to purchase signed copies of the book at the link which we shared on Eventbrite and Facebook. Chairing the discussion is Dr. Melanie Garson, a mediator, lawyer, and senior teaching fellow in international conflict resolution and international security at UCL, who also sits on the advisory board of the Pinsker Center. And on a final note, we're very grateful for your time, General McMaster. It's truly a great honor to host you, and on behalf of all the organizers and the audience, we all thank you for your service.
Well, hey, thank you, Jonathan, and thanks, Melanie. What a privilege it is to be with all of you. Thanks to all of you who've joined for the discussion tonight.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. Welcome to the UCL Virtual Campus, which this year is truly global. Welcome to everybody that's joining us from campuses in person, if you're lucky enough, or virtually across the globe. And again, thank you, Lieutenant General McMaster. It is truly a privilege and an honor to have you with us globally, and I hope one day that we'll be able to invite you actually to campus to perhaps at the release of your next book. And I know that really 1.5 days would not be enough to touch on the insights in this book, let alone 1.5 hours to bring out the wealth of experience and how it can inform perhaps the future of US and global policy making. So just to brief to everybody out there, the format tonight is I am going to take the supreme pleasure of having your time for about 45 minutes to ask all the questions that I have that have come out of the book. And then I'm going to turn it over to the questions that come in onto the Q&A. So what I would say, if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A box on Zoom. Please make sure that if you're from a university, put your name, put your university that you're from. And if you already see a question that's up there that's similar to the one that you like, put a thumbs up on it. That will automatically bring those questions right to the top. So we'll know that those are the most pressing questions of the hour, and we'll make sure that we'll get there, and we'll try and do as many of your questions as possible. So let's go. Battlegrounds. And I must admit, I really enjoyed this book, and this for the perpetual students of international security, foreign policy. This is the book we dream about. It's a soldier scholar really sort of testing the extent that some of the theories that we learn in the classroom, how relevant are they to the battlegrounds that we're coming up to? And for those of you that have not yet read it, it's this roller coaster foreign policy journey from US, China, Russia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and back to the US, and really looking under these broad themes of great power competition, transnational terrorists, hostile states becoming more dangerous, and beginning to cyber-enabled warfare. And for me, my favorite part, I must admit, and I've got to throw this in, is a very human perspective that underlies this book. The genius in this book is some of those relationships and the backgrounds and childhoods and histories of some of the people that you engage with are really part of the real beauty of this book. But I'm going to start with, for those of you people who haven't read the book yet, you have this broadly central theme throughout the book, drawing on Morgenthau's strategic narcissism, and that this has led to the US to consistently formulate policy that's based on fundamentally flawed thinking. And so just to put everyone on the same page, I was wondering, can you just sort of explain that concept and how it's come to manifest itself generally across US foreign policy?
Great. Well, thank you, Melanie. I introduced this idea of strategic narcissism to explain, I think, a phenomenon that has been prominent in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War in particular, and that is this tendency to define the world only in relation to us, and to assume that what the United States does or decides not to do is decisive to accomplishing a favorable outcome. And I think that the beginning of this tendency in U.S. foreign policy did begin with the optimism of the post-Cold War period. And I tell the story in the book about patrolling the East-West German border and seeing that dramatic change, right? From one moment, staring down East German border guards, to the next moment, seeing tens and then hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of East Germans flooding across that boundary, and then showering us with bouquets of flowers and bottles of wine, and there were hugs and tears of joy. And so there was reason to be confident as the East German government faded away and the Soviet Union collapsed. We won the Cold War. And that was followed very quickly by the lopsided military victory in the Gulf War. And it was during the 1990s, I think, that optimism grew to over-optimism, and then even hubris. And that was reflected in three assumptions about the post-Cold War world that were over-optimistic, certainly in retrospect they were. And that is, first of all, that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. A related assumption was that great power competition was a relic of the past. And then, of course, because of that lopsided victory in Desert Storm, we assumed that this so-called revolution in military affairs had guaranteed our security through our technological military prowess. And that if any foe in the future even had the temerity to challenge the United States, that war would be fast, quick, efficient, waged mainly from a distance. And this was all set up. It was a setup for profound disappointment, I think, in the 2000s, disappointments and shocks, shock associated with the most devastating terrorist attack in history on September 11th, 2001. But then also the unanticipated length and difficulty and costs of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we often debate, right? And I know that we've debated it quite frequently in the United States and in the UK and elsewhere. Should the United States and others, or the UK and other allies, have invaded Iraq in 2003? I think an even more fruitful debate would be, who the heck thought it would be easy, and why did they think it would be easy? And then we have the 2008 financial crisis. And I think it was at this moment when the emotional impetus behind our policy shifted from over-optimism to pessimism and resignation. And this is when you see, under the Obama administration, I think it becomes popular to believe that our disengagement from complex competitions overseas would be an unmitigated good. I think that's carried over to the Trump administration and this abhorrent approach to Afghanistan, for example. But what both of these approaches had in common is a failure to recognize the authorship over the future that the other has. In particular, adversaries, rivals, and enemies. And so strategic narcissism is a setup for failure because it's the basis for strategies and policies based on what the purveyor prefers rather than what the situation demands. And so the book is in large measure an argument for developing strategic empathy, which a term I borrow from a great historian named Zachary Shore. And that means paying particular attention to the ideology, the aspirations, the emotions that drive and constrain the other. And I guess predictably for an historian, I also argue that the best way to develop strategic empathy is to examine how at least the recent past produced the present as the first step in making a projection into the future.
Well, thank you, and I hope that gets everybody up to speed. And it's a very interesting lens that you bring throughout the whole book, and you bring to also strategizing towards the future. And I want to go to, perhaps you raise the issues of disappointments and disengagement, and something I want to get to a bit later is actually how that disengagement approach, interestingly enough, is shared by 20th century realists and the New Left, which is an interesting, where we think never the twain may meet, but we'll get to that in a bit. I want to go to actually starting with large disappointment. You call it the taboo topic in your book, and that is Afghanistan. And thinking about, you call it a failure that's not just practical and ethical, but ethical failure to some extent. You talk about how it really epitomizes the Einstein expression of the definition of lunacy, of trying to do the same thing again and again, expecting different results, but not getting it. And really, you quite pointedly point to this normalization of the Taliban being a large mistake and a misunderstanding of what the effect of that, particularly with Pakistan, will be on the overall relations. Now, sort of probably as you were concluding the book, you had the agreement that came up in February that we're beginning to see rumblings of what might play out. What's your take on that?
Well, Melanie, it's a catastrophe. It is an abhorrent failure, right? And of course, it is. I think it's an extreme example of strategic narcissism. In fact, what we did in Afghanistan is we just conjured the enemy that we would prefer, rather than the actual enemy with whom we were engaged. This occurred during the Obama administration, beginning in 2009, when that long Afghanistan review went on that resulted in a reinforced security effort, and at the same time announcing the schedule for the withdrawal of troops. I mean, I just oftentimes wonder if the great captains of history came back and looked at the way we're waging these wars, they would think we're crazy. Right? I mean, since when do you give, your a script, to your enemy and ask them to conform to it? Of course, they're not going to do that. War is a continuous interaction of opposites, as Clausewitz reminded us. So it was a fundamentally flawed approach to begin with, to announce the troop withdrawal on a timeline under the assumption that what we do is going to be decisive to achieving a favorable outcome. But in doing so, we assume that, hey, well, the Taliban's really not the enemy. Really, the real enemy is Al Qaeda, and it's mainly Al Qaeda in Pakistan. In fact, there's not really many Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. This was all delusional. In fact, all the facts cut against it. Right? I mean, there were major operations conducted that revealed the interconnected nature between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. These groups exist in an ecosystem, in this region, in which they share resources and people and expertise. The leaders of Al Qaeda have pledged bayat, to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, that the Taliban aspire to reestablish. And so we created this myth about the enemy. We actually stopped fighting the Taliban under the Obama administration, so we could talk to them. And established this Taliban political commission in Doha. I mean, we neglected the role that Pakistan plays in perpetuating the insurgency, and then assumed that Pakistan would change its behavior. The Pakistani army and the inter services intelligence, the arm of the party that sustains these terrorist organizations, would change its behavior. It was all self delusion. And when I came in as National Security Advisor, I made this a priority. I tell the story about this in the book, because not only do I think this was an unwise policy, but it is, as you suggested at the beginning, it's unethical. And as the war evolved, we no longer met, St. Thomas Aquinas's criteria for just war, because we did not have a just end even in mind anymore. And so I think the true test of strategy, Melanie, oftentimes is, can a platoon leader, a lieutenant, who's leading infantry on a dangerous mission, can he or she explain to his or her soldiers how the risks that they're going to take and how the sacrifices they may make would contribute to an outcome worthy of those risks and worthy of those sacrifices. And I think oftentimes in Afghanistan, I mean, we couldn't do that. And so I thought this was a matter of urgency, and there was a long process. It wasn't that long actually, but it was maybe painful process of getting options before President Trump. And then he made, I think, a decision that resulted in the first time in Afghanistan and a broader approach to South Asia, where we had a reasoned, sustainable, sound strategy that was oriented on worthwhile and important objectives, and that would pursue those objectives at a sustainable cost and at a sustainable level of risk, and to do so mainly with partners, Afghan partners in particular. The president's come back, he's stepped back from that in a dramatic way. He replicated the same flawed assumptions of the Obama administration and then magnified them, and in so doing, actually partnered with the Taliban against the elected Afghan government and against the 90% plus of Afghans who are opposed to a return of Taliban rule. And these assumptions that there's a bold line between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, okay, we know that's not true. Not all the concessions made, not demanding a ceasefire. I mean, after this agreement was made, there have been heinous attacks on maternity hospitals where, Taliban groups, have murdered, pregnant mothers and infants. I mean, we almost want to avert our eyes, like we don't want to look at it. It's so bad. I mean, look at the attack on Kabul University that was just conducted, for example. And so I think that it's abhorrent what we did. If we just wanted to leave, we should have just left. Right? We should have empowered the Taliban on the way out. So I guess the question is, what does power sharing with the Taliban look like? Does that mean,
was going to be my question.
Right? I mean, what does that look like? It looks like what we're seeing now, where you have this offensive in Helmand province, one in Khost as well. It's created a refugee crisis, just the latest in the serial refugee crises in Afghanistan. Those refugee crisis. That crisis is going to affect Pakistan. A nuclear armed country that if destabilized could have devastating consequences, and it's also going to destabilize Europe, because, as you know, besides the Syrian civil war, the second highest number of refugees coming into Europe has been from Afghanistan. So I think it's a catastrophe what's happening. What does it look like with the Taliban sharing power? Is it mass executions in the soccer stadium every other Saturday? Is that every other girls' school bulldozed? Right. So they haven't changed their nature. So I think that this is an extreme case of strategic narcissism. We're going to have to go back, we and our allies, because I think that this will again lead to a situation where jihadist terrorists are in control of population, territory, resources, in this case, a lucrative narcotics trade that is going to give them the ability, I think, to commit mass murder attacks, on the scale of 9/11. And then we've already seen how the ISIS and Al-Qaeda alumni are more dangerous even, I think, than the Mujahideen era alumni of the resistance to Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And the recent attacks in Europe, I think, in France in particular, should highlight the danger of these groups.
So, and just to sort of extend on that a little, and for whoever is in the administration, or for Vice President-elect, for President-elect Biden, what would then your strategy be? I mean, if you're going to put in strategic empathy at the basis of this, or what, in your hands, what would you be advocating right now?
Yeah, I would just say, okay, first of all, there are no short-term solutions to long-term problems. My dear friend and mentor, Fawad Ajami, in whose chair I sit, named for him, he talked about the same about the Middle East broadly, but he said, it's not a fast part of the world. Right? So what we need to do is have a sustainable level of engagement, recognizing that we're dealing with long-term problems, and the problem associated with jihadist terrorist organizations is a long-term problem. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to have hundreds of thousands of troops in the region. It means that we have to be able to enable partners, because we are really engaged in a, I think, in a modern day, war across a frontier really between barbarism and civilization. And those who are at that frontier are mainly the people of the region. And in Afghanistan, whereas 10 courageous American soldiers gave their lives this year in combat against ISIS, Khorasan, and Al Qaeda and the Taliban, 30 Afghan soldiers a day give their lives trying to preserve the freedoms that they've enjoyed since 2001 at the end of Taliban rule. I think they are worthy of our support. And it doesn't have to be hundreds of billions of dollars either. I mean, I think the commitment was aimed at maybe $15 billion a year. A very small troop presence from historical perspective, and I think we ought to think of it as an insurance policy, right? It's easy for us to see the cost of these operations, but oftentimes more difficult for us to imagine the cost of disengagement. But this isn't a theoretical example, right? We have 9/11. What I think Vice President Biden at the time, what he argued for, was a return to the counterterrorism policy of Bill Clinton, right? As you have to remember that Al Qaeda declared war on us in early 1990s. The first World Trade Center bombing was in 1994. It was a truck bombing of the World Trade Center carried off by Al Qaeda. We just continued to ignore Al Qaeda, and then of course they attacked our embassies in 1998, attacked one of our naval vessels. After which we fired a few cruise missiles into Afghanistan from the Indian Ocean, and then just called it a day. Well, how did that work out? I mean, look what happened on September 11th, 2001. So I think we have to recognize that in many cases we do have to require sustained engagement. In the book I use a couple of examples of successes, right? And these are not. First is Plan Colombia, a sustained effort with strong Colombian leadership. Began in the late 90s when everybody thought Colombia was on the path to a failed state, right? Colombia still has problems, but it's far from a failed state. It's succeeding. And the other example is South Korea. I mean, South Korea in 1953 looked pretty grim. I mean, they'd been through decades of war and brutal occupation. The country had no natural resources, a largely illiterate population, a corrupt government, and a hostile neighbor. Okay, what good is going to come out of this, right? Who are you going to put your money on? So, and of course, all the industrial capacity and everything was in the north at the time, right? So, it really looked like a hopeless effort. But when you have a strong people like the South Koreans who really started rebuilding at the in 1953 and never stopped, right? And then you have eventually economic reforms followed by democratic reforms that they got rid of kind of the military-led governments and authoritarian model in favor of democratic model. It's the fifth largest economy in Asia. It's a successful country. Okay, so but that didn't happen overnight, right? So I think we just have to be more patient in the West, and patience is not our strong suit.
And well, that's true. And let's move slightly along to a similar situation where patience and disengagement and some of the themes you mentioned. So some of the statistics of the imbalance of US soldier deaths and local deaths that you just mentioned, Afghanistan, you also draw up in your book in relation to Iraq. And you also draw up some of the similar themes of empowering local strategic partnership there to cross the sectarian divides. Certainly a place that my attention has recently returned to is Iraq. But given what we're seeing in the reshaping of the Middle East at the moment, the Abraham Accords, and it's sort of almost beginning to feel a little bit forgotten. And I'm wondering, what is your take on, as I say, having to keep Iraq forefront in this new dynamic?
Right. Well, Iraq is critical to really any effort to try to break the cycle of sectarian violence that we see across the region. I think the humanitarian catastrophe of the region is associated with this sectarian civil war that is in the interest both of jihadist terrorist organizations and of the Iranian regime. And what Iran is trying to do in the region, and Iraq is a major focus of this, is to apply the Hezbollah model more broadly in the region, where they have weak governments in power that are dependent on Iran for support, while they grow militias and other illegal armed groups that are outside of the government's control that can be turned against that government if the government acts against Iranian interests, right? This is the situation in Lebanon, sadly. Look what that's done to the Lebanese people. It's a state that is essentially in free fall from a financial perspective and a governance perspective. And then you have this in Iraq, where where Iran has been very adept at affecting essentially state capture over state institutions and functions. Now, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, the prime minister there, I know him well. I knew his predecessor, Haider al-Abadi. I read about Haider and tell his story in Battlegrounds. Well, they're not part of that, right? They want an independent and strong Iraq. But what Iran wants is they want to keep the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict so they can have this outsized influence across the region. This is what Iran has done in the support of Assad's regime and making possible the serial episodes of mass murder, which are the Syrian civil war. And this is what Iran was achieving in Yemen as well. And what's important to recognize about the specter of the IRGC's proxy armies and militias in the region is that it strikes fear in the hearts of Sunni Arab and Sunni Turkmen populations who fear evisceration and therefore tend to regard jihadist terrorist organizations as patrons and protectors. And this is a major source of support for these organizations, groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS and Nusra and so forth. So I think that and what I argue in the book is that we have to work along with our partners to break this cycle of sectarian violence as the first step in addressing the humanitarian crisis in the region, and then getting beyond these serial failures of governance. Iraq is at the forefront of that, obviously. Iraq, as you know, Melanie, is not naturally aligned with Iran. And I think that this is a diplomatic effort that is required, but there has to be a military component, I think, to have some physical support for the Iraqi government so that it at least can say no to Iran in its most aggressive initiatives. And we saw this come to a head in December, January of this past year, and come to a head in particular with the Iranian orchestrated attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, the attacks on our forces that inflicted casualties, and then the subsequent strike on Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, which I think was justified and I would use the word righteous, even because of what Soleimani has done to inflict so much death and suffering across the Middle East. So I think it's worth staying engaged, right? Because just when you think it can't get worse in the Middle East, it actually can. It can. And so I think that our engagement is a force for good there. I do believe that when we don't stay engaged, when I say we, I mean the free world, I mean the U.S., the U.K., and like-minded partners. Those of us who were in Syria, and until President Trump, made this, this sudden announcement of withdrawal. When that sort of thing happens, the U.S. and others are seen as unreliable partners. And then what countries in the region do is they hedge. They hedge. And I think the Abraham Accords is actually in part of that hedging strategy on the part of Bahrain and UAE in particular, because they realize that their security priorities actually align with those of Israel. and if the U.S. disengages, and this is maybe an extreme position to take, but I think there's an element of truth in it, is that the IDF may be one of the best guarantor of their security if the U.S. disengages. So I think no one would ever say that, and I want to put those words in their mouth, but I think it is a positive development because just the name Abraham Accords, it gets to this idea that we're all people of the book, and there are those who want to foment religious conflict. But I see the fight against jihadist terrorist organizations as a fight against those who use a perverted interpretation of Islam to justify criminal and political agendas. And I don't think we want to give them, the credibility of a legitimate religion, for example. So, sorry to go on about that, but I mean, I think the Middle East deserves a lot of attention. It's not getting it, as you mentioned, and I quote Ken Pollock in there, who years ago said, that we have this saying in the U.S., what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, right? Well, the Middle East does not adhere to Las Vegas rules, right? I mean, what happens in the region doesn't stay there. We know that from the many terrorist attacks that emanated from the Islamic State's, control of territory the size of Britain, for example, and I think it's really important for us to remain engaged.
And I agree, and we're just going to stay engaged just there a little bit longer in our discussion.
Right. I mean, the Middle East is not a fast part of the world, and I'm not the most succinct person. I've got to really try to.
No, not at all. I'm happy listening on our part, and I'm sure the whole audience agrees. We're happy. We're all sucking it all in. But I will say with the Middle East for a while, with of course a question that's really on everybody's mind, again in relation to rumblings that are coming out of potentially President-elect Biden's re-engagement with the JCPOA, or a version of the JCPOA, and Iran. Now, you in your book, you talk about how there was a sort of shift in your own personal attitude towards the JCPOA. At the outset, you believed that actually staying part of it was the strategic way forward, then because to be able to make change from the inside rather than the outside. But then your thinking shifts slightly, and you wanted to present a better range of alternatives of how to have an Iran strategy. In your hands to President-elect Biden, what would you be saying Iran's strategy should be?
Right. Well, thanks, Melanie. I would just start with that. I would say, hey, don't make the same mistake that the Obama administration made on Iran. Don't make the whole Iran strategy about this JCPOA or an Iran nuclear deal, right? Because I think in the pursuit of an agreement, kind of as an end in of itself, we wound up with, what was kind of a politically disadvantageous agreement that masqueraded as a diplomatic triumph, right? And the reason it was disadvantageous is because of all the concessions made that made the agreement weak. This is the sunset clause. This is the not including missiles, in the agreement, for example. It is the inadequate verification regime and inspection regime, such that, before the ink was dry on the agreement, the Iranians are saying, well, here are all the places you can't look at. Well, I mean, are we supposed to trust them now? I mean, really? So I think that the agreement itself was flawed, but then it was the failure to recognize how the agreement and sanctions relief associated with it would just give the Iranians more resources to apply to their 4-decade-long proxy war against the great Satan, the United States, the little Satan, Israel, the Arab monarchies, the West broadly as a sponsor of transnational terrorist organizations. And so I think that the strategy should aim to accomplish several objectives, and that they ought to evaluate any initiative based on what effect they have on these objectives, right? Objective one, okay, block all paths to a nuclear weapon, okay? The second objective might be to constrain the resources that are available to the regime such that they can no longer inflict so much human suffering on the region and perpetuate the cycle of sectarian violence and perpetuate state weakness, right, through state capture across the region. You prevent them from having the resources that necessary to in their design to place a proxy army on the border of Israel, for example. So I think that we ought to also impede their ability to develop other destructive weapons that they could use to threaten the region. And overall, we shouldn't neglect the ideology that drives the regime and its permanent hostility toward us. And what I argue in the book is that, hey, let's try to force them to make a choice, right? Hey, you can either be, a terrorist, a terrorist sponsor that engages in a proxy war against us, or you can be treated like a responsible nation. You can't have it both ways, because if we were to treat them like a responsible nation, they reap all the economic and financial benefits of that. Guess where those profits are going to go? They're going to go to those who are the true beneficial owners of those Iranian companies. And that's the Bunyads, which is the clerical order that's really in charge there, right? It's the, the smooth talking, speaks the Queen's English, Zarif. I mean, he's a shop window for the regime. So is Rouhani. I mean, it's Khamenei, and it's the Guardian Council, and it's the RGC. And by the way, they have controlling interest in these companies. They would reap the profits. They would launder that money and apply it to the proxy wars. I'll tell you, I argued for staying in the JCPOA to get our allies in Europe and elsewhere to impose sanctions on Iran outside of the deal for their support for terrorists and militias, and for the proxy war they're waging against us, and then to enforce the deal in such a way that Iran couldn't circumvent it. But then also with the option to get out at some point in the future. That didn't work. Of course, I knew when John Bolton seceded me. I mean, you could set your watch by. I mean, it wasn't going to be very long before we're out of the JCPOA. But it did result in a snapback of sanctions that I think are helpful to constraining the resources available to the regime. I don't think we should let up on that. I don't think now is the time to do it. I think that what we should aim for, as a long-term goal, is to help influence. We're not going to be the determinant of this, but help influence a shift in the nature of the Iranian regime, such that it ceases its permanent hostility to the United States, Israel, and the West. And this isn't like 2003 regime change, but this is the Iranian people making that choice, recognizing the corrupt nature of their government, and the fact that their government is pursuing policies that have resulted in them being regarded as a pariah state and unable to meet the vast potential of the country. So that's a policy that I would recommend. I think the Biden administration is not going to do that, sadly. I think they're going to rush back to this kind of conciliatory approach with the regime that hasn't panned out. And what I write about in Battlegrounds is, hey, that isn't unique to the Obama administration. Many administrations, really all of them, going back to the Carter administration, have pursued this conciliatory approach in the hope that conciliation with some of Iran's leaders will lead to the Republicans or the reformers gaining influence over the revolutionaries, or the conservatives, right, or the ideologues. Well, I mean, that didn't work, right? I mean, there have been struggles at times, but now, the revolutionaries won, and we have to deal with that reality.
And I think, thinking about that and thinking about, is it getting behind something else, is wondering whether, and you sort of intimate it slightly in the book, whether with the focus on the nuclear side is sort of distracting us from other strategies, particularly more grey zones, cyber attacks that are going on, sort of interference with critical infrastructure that we're seeing. So that a whole nother strategy that is coming up that needs some sort of retaliation, but it's being lost in this argument or this focus on the nuclear side, and that there's a bigger picture that we need to be looking at Iran for.
Absolutely, and Iran is in a race to develop more effective offensive cyber capabilities. We saw what they did against Aramco. We saw the 2007, I think it was, wasn't it, Melanie, attacks on the U.S. financial system? Yeah. So that's a long time ago. I'm sure they're much better now. We're much better at defense as well. We're much better at offense now from a cyber perspective and a policy associated with cyber defense. But this is we have a lot of vulnerabilities, right? Because we have a huge attack surface, right? A surface area to defend, and Iran is becoming more and more adept. They're also becoming more adept at cyber-enabled information warfare, although it's still kind of clumsy. Their effects, their efforts during the U.S. presidential election were not very effective, but they'll get better at that for sure. And then we also saw some development of other advanced capabilities, like the drone attacks on Aramco as well. So I think you're right. I mean, we can't become too myopic on the nuclear program. Nuclear program is very dangerous, though, of course. And I don't know what's caused some of the problems that they've had at facilities, but I think it's appropriate to do everything possible to disrupt their path to a nuclear capability. And I think it'll be interesting to watch what the Israelis do. I mean, I believe they're probably, preparing for the enforcement of the kind of Begin doctrine again, and I would not be surprised, to see military preparations of some kind as a result of that, right? So it's a very dangerous period. Iran is bringing that danger, I think, onto themselves, and we're back in many ways. We're like back to like a 2008 period. Remember, like when these tensions were high. I think we're back to it about just over a decade later.
And yeah, I'm thinking about back to that time, but with one strategic difference. So you bring out in that a little bit in the book. It's sort of a tiny bit. I thought it was really interesting. Is this need to bring back Turkey somehow out of the grassroots? Because I think there's a real fundamental difference if we're looking 2008 now. And you mentioned it a little bit to say, well, Turkey's alignment with Russia and Iran really doesn't meet its interests, but somehow the US and Europe have to get Turkey back out of that mix, and particularly because of the way it sits in NATO. What would be your recommendations there? You could do that. I found that very interesting.
Well, I think we have to try to reach the Turkish people through people-to-people connections, through business connections, and the military connections that still kind of exist. Although those officers with the most experience in NATO have been purged because they're viewed as unreliable by the AKP and by Erdogan. But I think we have to play kind of a longer game there. As you know, Melanie, the AKP is not monolithic itself. There are factions within it, and there certainly is a growing kind of political opposition to the AKP. What I worry about most with Turkey these days is the steady diet of anti-Western, anti-American, largely propaganda that's being directed at the Turkish people through the state-controlled media. And what I tried to explain to my counterparts in Turkey, I said, hey, I don't know why you're doing this. Let's take a look at the countries who have engaged in this activity and where they are now. Right? I mean, it's not a pretty picture, And then I also tried to, I made a diagram actually of our interests vis-a-vis really the Syrian civil war, but in the Middle East overall, Turkey's interests, Saudi Arabia's interests, Iranian interests, Russian interests, and they're all color coded and showed like where they overlapped. And it showed like just a complete overlap, with our interests with Turkey, with the exception of Turkish concerns over the YPG, and the PKK, are elements associated with the YPG. This is the Kurdish Workers' Party, and said, okay, we can manage this, right? I mean, for all of this that we need to work on together, we can work through this issue with the YPG through greater transparency, through all the things we tried. It didn't work, and it didn't work. I think because Erdogan I think he does kind of fancy himself as the new sultan, of a re-emerging Ottoman Empire. I know it sounds kind of like crazy or maybe Dr. Evil-esque, for us, but I mean, he really thinks it, and you see it now with the use of these Islamist militias that I think are very dangerous, right? These Islamist militias are, they adhere to kind of a Salafi jihadist ideology. They're like one step away, I think, from Takfiri, terrorist organizations. They were engaged in murder of, the Kurdish politician and other Kurds, as they made the incursion into northern Syria that President Trump welcomed them into, and it's just a terrible decision. But these proxies are being used in Libya in support of the government of national accord against Russia supported Haftar's forces, Russia, Egypt, and others supported in Idlib province, and now in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think, when is the point at which Erdogan gets some buyer's remorse in connection with this relationship with Putin? Why the heck is he buying S-400 missiles, right? I mean, there are going to be some severe consequences to that. The lira is plummeting right now. What can we do? I think we could say, hey, your economic lifeline is with the West. Maybe Kemal Ataturk was right, in connection with secularism, nationalism, and Westernism, right? Maybe those pillars were right for Turkey. You have the lira collapsing. 80% of Turkey's trade is with Europe. What the heck are they doing? France and Germany are both at their wits' end with Erdogan and the AKP. This is associated with the way that their nationals have been treated within Turkey, but it's also a manifestation of of Turkey's aggression in the Eastern Mediterranean vis-a-vis Greece and another NATO member. So, I mean, all the trends are bad for Turkey, and you saw what Erdogan did with the municipal elections last year, right? He ordered another election and then lost by a larger margin. Elections do still matter in Turkey, even though Erdogan has captured state institutions in a way that's unprecedented, including the media, but the judiciary, the police, universities, schools, civil society groups. I mean, it's extraordinary what he's been able to do. But I think that we have to work around him. I mean, he's not going to be there forever, obviously, and we have to cultivate relationships with those who ultimately may shift Turkey back toward the West.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned this, Alton. I had the pleasure a number of years ago with Pinsker Center. We had General Amasya in person at UCL, and he also talked, I think his speech at the time was called The Story of a Sultan, a Tsar, and a King. And he was talking at that point to similar analogies. So great
Right.
minds, clearly, of great
Melanie,
generals.
Melanie, if anybody has doubts about it, just look at the palace he built. Right? If you want to understand his aspirations, just look at the palace.
Right. I want to we go to, and there's still so much in the book, and I do want to turn over to questions in a minute, but of course, and I'm sure some of these will cross over, having a quick look, Russia. That we've talked about, you talk about how Trump's relationship with Russia is based on a whole series of flawed rationalizations and ignorance of history that really need to be rejected for strategy. Now, it's been really interesting watching some of the Russian press about the election, which is one of my favorites was when they were comparing both Trump and Biden to radishes. One's a pickle radish and one's a radish, but a radish can be as sweet as a pickle radish, and clearly that's Russian wisdom that is slightly beyond us. But what the Russian relationship is going to be one that needs an entire rethink with a new administration. What would you be putting at the forefront of that?
Well, I would just say, hey, don't fall for it, right? Don't fall for again. This idea that I don't know if how many of you are familiar with the holiday cartoon, The Grinch That Stole Christmas, right? This this idea that we can build a relationship with Putin. He'll become like the Grinch on Christmas Eve. His heart will grow 2 sizes bigger. He'll stop his campaign of political subversion against us. That's not going to happen. And I think that for too many administrations, this is George W. Bush, remember, looking into Putin's soul, and this is President Obama really driving this reset approach to Russia and kind of really forcing Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to bring a reset button to Lavrov. And, that was kind of a disaster. Or President Obama leaning over to Medvedev and saying, hey, we have more flexibility after the election, and trading off missile defenses in Poland, or President Trump's like inexplicable reluctance to call out Putin for even the most brazen and obvious acts of subversion against us, or of aggression broadly, in the hopes of, wouldn't it be good to have a good relationship with Russia? Yeah, it would be good, but it's not going to happen under Putin. So I think, especially now as we've seen the poisoning of Navalny, which I quote my old counterpart Mark Sedwell, in the book. He says that Putin engages in implausible deniability. Whether it's the shoot down of the airliner over Ukraine in 2014, or the Skripal poisoning, or the Navalny poisoning, he suggests, Navalny must have poisoned himself somehow, with a banned, military grade nerve agent. Okay, but the President Trump has kind of aided that implausible deniability, in the words of Mark Sedwell, and I think that we have to get better at this, pulling the curtain back, showing his true behavior, and imposing costs on Russia that go beyond the costs that he may have factored in at the beginning of his aggressive actions. This is a person who's literally been able to get away with murder because we've been weak in our responses. Why there are undeclared Russian intelligence agents in any Western country, I don't know. Kick him out. Why is Nord Stream 2 still going? Why would Germany want to give Putin coercive power over their economy and their energy supply, and then more leverage over Ukraine? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So I think that we all need to work together to convince Putin, hey, you can't get away with it anymore. And then I think, again, similar to with Erdogan, play kind of a longer game with at least those that are outside of Putin's inner circle. I think positive business relationships with Russia it would be good, but the Russian economy, as you know, it's stagnant. The collapse of oil prices now, COVID, the second wave of COVID is hitting them very hard. The first wave did too. Their medical system is not prepared for it, especially in rural areas. You have the protests against Putin in the east, and you have the protests in response to the rigging of the municipal elections that occurred that indicate that Putin may be outliving his popularity, right? The extension of his rule till 2036. Will he make it that long? I don't know. I mean, it looks pretty bleak. His mechanisms of power involve kind of the protection racket that he's on the top of. He has dirt on everybody and keeps them from using that dirt against each other, right? So that everybody's profiting. So I think that we have to play kind of a longer game. I think it may be past time to expose some of his corruption. Where his money is. He's potentially one of the wealthiest people on earth, and a lot of those he's wealthy a lot in large measure because of handshake deals, though, where he gets a cut of some of the profits of the oligarchs who he protects, which is one of the reasons I think he wants to stay in power, right? Because once he's out of power, I don't know how he collects on those debts. So I think it's we ought to play, if he wants to play dirty, I think we ought to play clean and use transparency and shine the light on the true nature of his rule and his various bank accounts.
Interesting. Well, there are a whole pile of questions here, but before I turn over to them, and as I say, I could keep going, but I'm going to try and integrate some of mine into some of the ones that we have coming up here. But before we do that, and it does actually tie in with Matt Cummins's question here a little bit, is I just want to turn to the US for a bit, because that is where you end the book quite interestingly, and you talk about the question of that national pride for countries is really important, and that the extent that the partisan vitriol that's been going on is pretty toxic from a security perspective. It creates uncertainty. It can't have a strong security strategy abroad when you're severely divided at home. And you sort of bring in Fukuyama and say that when everyone tweets about their differences, perhaps they should also think about what are their similarities in America rather than doing that. Can just before I move to these questions, can you speak a little bit more about how, in what will be, wherever this election finally gets decided, a very, very divided America, and how can the administration overcome that to be able to be strong, perceived as strong externally after what has been actually quite difficult for the world outside to watch?
Yeah, well, Melanie, it's been a difficult year all around, right, for all of us, right? So I think it's in many ways a quadruple crisis in the United States of the pandemic, the recession associated with the pandemic, the social divisions laid bare by George Floyd's murder and the aftermath of his murder, and growing concerns associated with that over unequal treatment under the law, inequality of opportunity, and then now this this vitriolic political season from which we will eventually emerge. I think that I think we'll emerge from it much stronger, right? I mean, the United States has an extraordinary ability for self-correction and for bringing Americans back together. I think that this last election, whereas it wasn't a pretty picture maybe from afar, I think it's an extremely positive story. I mean, record numbers of Americans voted, and we are divided. But if we were unified, we'd be a one-party system. That sounds kind of like communist China to me, right? And I think we have an opportunity to reinvigorate this, our democratic processes. Our election was very secure, no matter what President Trump says inexplicably. And we have a process in place that's going to adjudicate, the remaining electoral college votes and so forth. Our founders put into place a great system that we ought to be proud of, right? They recognized, mainly because of the experience of the English Civil War, the bloody wars of the 17th century, that we needed separation of powers. So the executive branch actually has no say in the transition of governments. It will be smooth, and it'll be an opportunity, I think, for us to come together. What what you're alluding to as well, though, I think the need for a conscious effort to restore pride in who we are as Americans and our common identity. What I see today is an interaction between kind of identity politics, or how you want to label that, and bigotry and racism. And these are two polar extremes that interact with each other in a way that creates centripetal forces that pull us apart from one another. These fringe groups are magnified, their voice is magnified by social media, and the avarice of these social media companies that use algorithms to show us more and more extreme information that confirms our biases rather than challenges them. It's magnified by the pseudo media and conspiracy theories, some of which President Trump inexplicably endorses, right? And it also reflects in large measure a lack of confidence in authoritative sources of information that really most Americans used to go to and have kind of a common understanding of particular issues. In the United States now, if you lean one way politically, you watch one cable news station. If you lean the other way politically, you watch one of two others. And there has been kind of a movement toward orthodoxy and in some of our mainstream media, right? I think it's terrible what's happened in the New York Times, for example, that you have to believe in a certain kind of liberal creed, left-leaning creed, if you're to write for the editorial pages there anymore. If any of the listeners haven't read Barry Weiss's letter when she departed the New York Times, it's worth doing. Then you have kind of the alt-right media, which is a reaction to that, right? We have to stop this and come together as Americans. I think that has a lot to do with how we understand our history. I think we can have pride in the radical idea of our revolution, that sovereignty lies with the people, not with king or not with parliament. I think we ought also have pride in the rights that are enshrined in our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But we should be disappointed, right, that it took us almost 100 years to remove the greatest blight on our history, slavery, but also then be proud of the fact that it was those rights on which we were founded, the principles on which we were founded, that made slavery ultimately untenable, and then resulted in the emancipation of 4 million of our fellow Americans after the bloodiest war in our history. We can then, of course, be disappointed in the failure of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, and the period of separate but equal, but then again celebrate the achievements of the civil rights movement and the dismantlement of de jure segregation and inequality of opportunity, while recognizing de facto inequality of opportunity and segregation still exist. But I think overall, in our democratic societies broadly, we should celebrate the fact that we have a say in how we're governed. We can demand better from our leaders. If you're in China, you can't do that, right? Xi Jinping just gave a speech and said, hey, I'm putting annexes on to concentration camps because the Uyghurs, they love it. They love being re-educated in concentration camps, right? We don't live in that kind of a society. I think we ought to also take pride in the fact that we have rule of law that prevents those kind of egregious abuses of our rights. We have due process of law and equal rights under the law. We should also celebrate the fact, that we have freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So I think there is a real crisis of confidence, not just in the U.S. but across the West. I think we ought to also be proud of the fact that there aren't too many people trying to immigrate into communist China. I think the Trump administration really blew it on immigration. I wish they'd, instead of talking about like who you don't want, talk about who we do want, right? I mean, do you believe in rule of law and our democratic form of government? Do you believe in our free market economic system, and that if you work hard, you can create a better life for your children and generations to come? I mean, do you believe in tolerance and equal treatment and under the law, regardless of race and religion and sexual orientation, whatever? I mean, if you believe that, hey, we want you. We want you. And so I think we need kind of we need a focus, focused on, on restoring national pride, not with like a contrived happy view of our history, but a view that is at least, not, I think, what has become kind of the orthodoxy of the new left interpretation of history, which I think is in large measure, an interpretation of self-loathing, that we have to get beyond.
Well, that certainly, I think, answered a number of the questions that I think are on people's minds. But just to take a huge leap, and this has come up with a couple of people, there's Sherman and also Peter Byrne from Durham, the question to a whole different frontier, Space Force. So what do you think? Will it still have relevance in the Biden era? Is this a US dominance in space important still? I would put my own personal sort of addition on that in relation to the other growing frontiers you mentioned before about the multiple levels that we are having to defend upon right now. So the virtual and the real. Where do you sit on the Space Force argument?
Okay, well, I didn't think it was necessary at the time, but now that it's happened, I think it's okay. I think it's good because it really is an important contested now domain, right? We had operated for a long time under the assumption that if we didn't weaponize space, nobody else would. But sadly, it happened. Both Russia and China developed and are now kind of almost advertising their offensive capabilities in space because I think they saw space as one of our differential advantages. So space is important, obviously, for not just military and security purposes, but for commercial purposes. And when we have to protect it, we have to make our space capability more resilient. I think Space Force will help do that, right, by integrating efforts across the military, but then also coordinating those efforts with civilian aspects of space infrastructure, as well as space exploration and so forth. I would recommend, the space strategy, the U.S. space strategy, to read it. It's actually quite a good document. I mean, I'm biased again. We worked on that. I worked on that in part, but there is obviously classified, strategy that is associated with that unclassified space strategy. But the strategy recognizes that space is no longer the domain only of the public sector and or the military and organizations like NASA. It is now a commercial domain, and that has brought tremendous opportunities along with it. The vast reductions in cost, for putting payloads into space, for example, is just one example of that. What companies like SpaceX and now Amazon and who have the capital to invest and enjoy some government support to do so, have achieved some tremendous efficiencies and capabilities. Organizations like Planet Labs, that puts these inexpensive satellites into low Earth orbit, have allowed us to really reap the benefits in connection with monitoring, climate change or wildfires, even and other natural disasters, as well as providing needed transparency to like North Korea's nuclear program, for example, in ways that previously were only in the purview of governments. I think that the way we become more resilient in space is through multinational cooperation. I think in the future, satellites should only rarely carry U.S. only or France only or Germany or UK only, data and payloads and capabilities. They ought to be multinational because that poses your adversaries with a real dilemma. Do you want to take on all of us at once if you blind or dazzle or shoot down a satellite? So I think we have to think of space as a contested domain and apply kind of deterrence theory to space in a way that we haven't, and in particular deterrence by denial, right? To convincing adversaries they can't accomplish their objectives through the use of force. So yeah, I think Space Force it's okay. I mean, I'm glad we did it now, kind of in retrospect. The deputy commander of Space Force in the U.S. is hyper competent person. If you ever want to talk from him, his name is Bill LaCourie. He was the main author of the space strategy as well. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you. Now I'm going to turn to what we've not touched to yet, and it's an incredible few chapters in your book, China. And I really enjoyed these chapters because just for the story of element, I mean, it's beautiful. Anyway, I really recommend people reading it. You actually feel you're on that trip with you. It's tremendous. But Arba Gerger, one of our UCL alums, he asked, will the US counteracting the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and which challenges the US naval supremacy, leading to outsourcing of US military efforts to companies like Germany, Turkey, and India and Japan. So ideally, those four countries should be more powerful to challenge Chinese regional hegemony ambitions. So you write a bit about this, or quite a lot about this in your chapters, and maybe you want to expand upon that for us.
Right. Well, I think it's really important to place One Belt, One Road and these other strategies in context of what China's trying to achieve overall. And China is driven, right these chapters, I believe, by a combination of fear and ambition. Fear of losing control, and ambition to realize the vision of national rejuvenation, take center stage in the world. And the goals are to, I think, create exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region, such that China is able to recreate the old tributary system of previous Chinese empires, and to do so really through servile relationships with countries in the region. Servile relationships that are developed based on the overmatched capabilities of the People's Liberation Army, as you suggest, as well as setting these debt traps for countries, so that they are really ensnared in kind of this relationship of dependency on China. And so the other objective for China is to challenge the free world globally, to be able to set kind of standards and to dictate terms associated with Chinese Communist Party preponderance of power and control over global logistics networks, as well as communications networks. And this is why Chinese companies are running both sides of the Panama Canal. For example, this is why China is subsidizing the installation of fifth generation communications infrastructure across the world with Huawei and so forth. So I think we ought to recognize that those are the goals. And then we have to put together, obviously, a strategy and an approach across the free world to counter this kind of pernicious form of aggression that aims to put China in a position of relative advantage over us, and to be able to dictate terms. You see what they're doing this within in international organizations as well, which we can talk about. But I think the best way to do it, and what I read about in the book, is to try to turn what the Chinese Communist Party perceives as weaknesses into our greatest strengths. So what does the Chinese Communist Party fear? Well, they fear that the Chinese people might have the temerity to suggest, well, maybe they should have a say in how they're governed, right? Well, then we ought to strengthen our democratic principles and institutions, and confidence in our principles, and strengthen our institutions and our processes, and do so really across the free world, and with countries that are interested in strengthening representative forms of government and democratic governance. The Chinese Communist Party fears rule of law, because if you have rule of law, you can't toss 1.5 million people in concentration camps and reduce an ethnic group's birth rate by 60%, which they've done with Uyghurs, or repress human freedom in Hong Kong, and force the resignation of these legislators we saw in the last 36 hours or so. And so we ought to strengthen rule of law in our own country, but in others, who aspire to live without fear of the capricious and aggressive actions of an authoritarian regime. They fear freedom of press, freedom of information, right? So they put into place the social credit score system. They police their own citizens' actions as well as their thoughts, right? And they're building the information firewall even larger. Why don't we bypass that? Why don't we help give the Chinese people access to alternative sources of information? I think that would be a positive thing. As we strengthen, as I mentioned, we need to maybe our professional standards in our fourth estates, and ensure that we do have more authoritative and unbiased sources of information that we can have confidence in. So it has been investigative journalists, who have pulled the curtain back on some of the most nefarious Chinese behavior, from Sri Lanka to Ecuador to Australia. John Garneau's study was a landmark study in connection with Chinese influence and Chinese efforts to co-opt elites and dominate the narrative and advance their interests and intimidate Australia into supporting their agenda. I just think that we can compete by turning what the party perceives as our weaknesses and what would be challenges to their authority into our greatest strengths.
And so linked with that, and it's interesting because you talk about a more sort of transparent, sort of almost like a reduction of the security dilemma through this sort of contained transparency. I think you talk about in the book, which is an interesting sort of how to open up that sort of misperception, perception problem. But how does that, and this guy links to a question we got from Charlie Millington, to do with technological development and the empowerment of sort of AI technology is a huge investment that's coming from, and you mentioned this in the book, the relationship between Chinese investment into infrastructure. How is that going to affect the great power competition?
Well, in a number of ways. First of all, whoever masters the application of AI technology will have a position of competitive advantage in the emerging data-driven global economy. And then, of course, the promise of AI is that it can speed decision making and action in war, you know, and give one side a differential advantage. You know, the U.S. has pledged to never use force or to employ destructive power without a human making that decision. China has not made that kind of a pledge, and I think it's quite dangerous, you know, from that perspective. So I think what we need to do is invest in the development of technologies so we maintain a differential advantage, but as we're doing so, to protect really our competitive advantages in a way that we haven't. We have engaged in expensive research and development efforts and then just allowed China to steal that or enforce the transfer of that sensitive technology and intellectual property to them. And to do so in a way that transfers it not just to Chinese companies that gain an unfair advantage, but to the People's Liberation Army, because under the national security law, these companies have to act as an extension of the party and of the People's Liberation Army and of the Ministry of State Security. And so we have to be we have to recognize that. You know, I think it's really should be embarrassing that U.S. Venture capital and private equity firms invested more in Chinese AI companies than they did in American AI companies in 2018, for example. This is the data that I had available. I'm sure this may have been the same in 2019. I think it's crazy that Wall Street is financing, you know, the China's efforts to overmatch us with vast investments in pursuit of short-term profits that are going to redound to our long-term disbenefit. So I think that we have to recognize that we are being in many ways our own worst enemy. Any of these remedies that we come up with, though, have to be adopted across the free world, because China will use us against each other, right? They will force Caterpillar out of market share in China as a way of punishing the United States, and then offer that market share to Mitsubishi or something, and then they'll just we have to work together on this. I think that we ought to come up with something equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath, you know, for investing and doing business in China, to not do any harm, and to not do any harm like in three ways, right? First, don't help the state repress their own people, right? Don't help them or invest in companies that are perfecting this Orwellian police state. The second would be don't invest in companies or in projects that are going to be turned against us, such that the People's Liberation Army will gain a differential advantage potentially over us in the future. And the third would be not to compromise the long-term viability of your own company and your long-term profits for short-term gains. And this has happened with so many companies, you know, that have been lured in by, you know, the promise of access to the Chinese market. You know, this is solar panels, wind turbines, the automotive industry. You could even say earlier, you know, this is high density batteries, and what we do is we give up intellectual property, sensitive technology. Chinese companies, you know, steal that essentially, and then apply it to their own production. They then overproduce, restrict our access to the Chinese market, but then dump these artificially low-priced goods in the international market to drive our companies out of business. I mean, this is a pattern that is like, it's happened over and over again, right? So when do we realize this and begin to take collective action to protect ourselves against a statist economic model that is using mercantilist policies against us while they enjoy all the benefits of the international economic order, and use those benefits against us through their membership in the World Trade Organization and the trade status that we grant them, without demanding reciprocal arrangements in connection with market access and so forth.
Well, that's certainly the sort of strategic credo that needs to be put in place when we're looking in that direction. And staying with that direction, of course, is something that deeply implicates the relationship with China. And actually one of the areas where in your book you sort of recommend a continue as strategy, which is a strategy of maximum pressure. This question has come from Natal Green from the University of Bath about what is to come for the US-North Korea relationship, and what would you again be advocating to President-elect Biden if when it comes to dealing with North Korea, because another relationship that will need some realignment.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that we have to test this thesis, and it's really a thesis, right? That Kim Jong-un can be convinced that he's safer without the weapons than he is with them, and his regime is safer without them than with them. And I think the only way to do that is through a campaign of maximum pressure that keeps the sanctions in place, and then really begins to improve enforcement of these unprecedented UN Security Council sanctions. And I think a range of other measures that can be put in place to impel others, persuade others to enforce those sanctions, secondary sanctions, for example, on financial institutions that, you know, that allow North Korea to benefit from illicit financial flows, for example, or financial flows that violate those sanctions. So I mean, I think that we never really did it, right? We didn't pursue maximum pressure. There was a bit of an alleviation of pressure based on the summits that occurred. I was relieved, however, at the failure of the Hanoi summit, which at least meant that the U.S. wasn't going to make concessions and repeat the failed pattern of previous efforts to denuclearize, which is really essentially that North Korea will commit an act of provocation. We will rush to negotiate with them. We being the United States, oftentimes with international partners. In exchange for the privilege of talking to them, North Korea will then demand a huge payoff, and then engage in long, drawn-out, frustrating negotiations during which we make concession after concession, and then end with a weak agreement that North Korea immediately breaks, and then uses that agreement to lock in the status quo as kind of the new normal. You know, we can't afford that anymore. And so I really do think that this maximum pressure approach is the only one that's feasible. And again, I as I argue in the book, I would try to bypass, you know, the barriers to information in North Korea. I would try to, you know, to try to communicate with the North Korean people in a way that you know, that at least helps them begin to think about their lives in a different way, right? What I'm concerned about is if there ever was a collapse of the Kim family regime in the North, if there ever was a unification, I mean, and Landkoff writes about this in a great book called The Real North Korea, that the real barriers to that kind of integration, they're going to be financial and economic, certainly, but they're mainly going to be, you know, they're really going to be psychological.
Thank you. Well, I am aware we are kind of over time, and you've been more than generous with your time. And I'm sure we could, there's still a host of questions and we could keep going, but I'm afraid we can't take up any more of yours.
I think I've got somebody texting me to do something that I'm missing, but I'm not sure.
I know. My apologies. My apologies for that. I would lost track of time. I just want to wrap up with the last one of the things you end your book is with saying that Zachary Shaw observed that the greatest source of national strength is an educated populace. And I think, and that is where we're at with everybody that came today from whatever side of the spectrum, from ever in the world that you are, to come and listen and be part of that educated populace on which global security rests. General McMaster, I cannot say thank you enough. It has been an extraordinary pleasure to be able to listen to you. I do highly recommend everybody really reads the book. Thank you, as ever, to the Pinsker Center and all the partners. Thank you, UCL. Thank you for the Center of US Politics, UCL. And thank you all for joining us this evening. It has been incredible. And I'm sure that globally, the virtual applause or the real applause is resounding off the roofs virtually across the world. Thank you so very, very much.
No, thank you so much, Melanie, and thanks to all of you. What a privilege it was to be with you for this discussion, and hopefully in a post COVID world, we'll be able to have a pint together, and it'd be great to see everybody in person at some point. Thank you.
We look forward to it. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.